In all honesty, before I even get into the sermon, I want to kind of explain why I chose this passage from the lectionary and where this came from. I realize that week after week, I do not tend to, even in my own soul, be a particularly soft, inspiring kind of person. It's not really who I am to provide little devotional thoughts. It's not in me. And so I know that week after week I can say these kind of things that are on the prophetic edge, right? And I say these difficult things to hear. And I don't even avoid political things. I have very strong political partisan opinions. I don't feel ashamed about that, but I do try to recognize that it's there, and then I just give it to everybody, right? I want everybody to feel like we're part of the problem. And so I have been thinking, okay, how can I do a better job of making sure that I'm not just preaching at you, and then you kind of leave with, well, what do I even do about what he said, right? And so the first step of that was that I started creating these little weekly to-dos, right? So when you come in, you get this in your bulletin, and there's usually 5 to 7 daily journaling opportunities, devotional reflection opportunities that are trying to apply the sermon. So that was step number 1. And then last week in Sunday school, our friend Miriam, she was like, okay, what do we do about all the things that you're saying, right? You talk about these big global or political issues, and it feels like it's so out of reach. The problems in our country, the problems in our city, the problems on our block are so big. What do we even do about it? I don't know where to even start. And so this sermon and the choice of this passage, ironically, are going to be part of my attempt to give us an answer to that question. So, some American scholars and historians and sociologists have wondered why it is that Americans have such a hard time realizing that sometimes we are the bad guy. Why are we so resistant to the thought that historically there are times we as a people, we as a church, we as a nation get it wrong? Why is it difficult? Why, for example, does the Smithsonian highlighting centuries of slavery bother so many of us? Why does the myth persist in American society that we're innocent and we're always on the right side of history? And one thought among historians and sociologists is this: that other than the Confederate South, Americans as a whole have never known defeat in war. And that there's something that happens when you're defeated in war that forces self-reflection that you don't have to participate in if you're always the ones winning the war. Defeat has a way of forcing you to examine yourself. After World War II, for example, the Germans had to reckon with their defeat and their own legacy. I don't know if you noticed this recently, President Trump was interviewing the chancellor in Germany, and it was on D-Day, right? And President Trump said to him, he said, yeah, that was a hard day for your country, wasn't it? And it was really interesting because the guy's response revealed the deep level of self-reflection that Germany had to go through after their defeat in World War II. Did anybody remember what he said? Did anybody see this? He said, actually, it wasn't a sad day for us at all. It was the day our country was liberated from a fascist terrorist regime. After their defeat in World War II, initially, the Germans had to find somebody to blame for their defeat. And so they do the predictable thing that all people do, right? When you experience hardship, when you get resistance, you want to blame somebody else, right? You know this in your own families, in your own marriages, in your own friendships. Somebody comes to you and they're like, you're wrong. And you're like, nope, you're wrong. Or they're wrong. Everybody's wrong but me, right? And this is Germany's initial response. It's predictable for human nature. But as time went on, you started having philosophers, politicians, and pastors in Germany starting to come to grips with German failure. In fact, they coined a new term that is one of those German words that is sort of compounded and everything is pushed together. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I haven't had German in about 20 years, but I'm pretty sure a natural German speaker here would be like, you nailed it, bro. Which loosely translates to processing the past. In Isaiah 59, what we encounter is Israel somewhere between the poles of innocence and defeat. They're returning to the promised land after centuries in Babylonian exile, but they're having to wrestle with, why did God allow us to go into exile to begin with? Why did God allow the Babylonians to come in, take over our land, destroy our temple, take our best and brightest, and disperse them all over creation? Why did God allow that to happen? And at first they were just like, well, it probably means that God's not king anymore, that our God lost the battle against the Babylonian gods. But the priests were like, no, that's not a sufficient answer. But further, when they're returning to the promised land after the exile, they also have to wrestle with the fact that things are not going well. Politically, they're having a hard time getting organized. Economically, things are falling through, and they're still a pretty weak nation. And so they're like, if our God is king, if our God is sovereign, why isn't God hearing our prayers? Why isn't God seeing our plight? Is God blind? Is God's hand too short to save us? Is God's ear too deaf to hear us? What is the problem? And as humans tend to do, they begin to blame someone else for their problems. It must be God's fault. It must be the Babylonians' fault. It must be somebody else's fault but me. But one of the interesting things you read about, and I know this is a part of the Old Testament that most folks don't read, but I think it's one of the parts I find most fascinating, is that every time Israel tries to blame someone else for what's happening in their national life, God sends Israel the prophets. And the prophets are fascinating because they say these things that nobody wants to hear. They're not afraid to be partisan, but they do try to give it to everybody. And so they come along and they're like, listen, you're not going to blame shift and make this about somebody else. You are going to have to process your past to understand why you are in this moment and to understand how the future can be better. The prophet said that the real issue behind Israel's national tragedies was not Assyrian political might. That the real issue behind their national tragedies was not Babylonian military might. The real issue behind Israel's national tragedies was their own failure in their relationship with God. The prophet said if this were merely a political or a military failure, then there's no lesson to be learned here. Get more politically organized, grow a bigger military, the end. But if this is a failure that is related to how we relate to God, then we are going to have to come to terms with our past in order to have a more hopeful future. Isaiah in particular says God's hands are not too short that God can't reach down and save us. And God's ears are not plugged up with cotton so that God cannot hear us. So if we want to know why hasn't God rescued us from this tragedy, when God is clearly perfectly capable of doing it, we need to get curious. I don't know about you, but for those of you who, like me, go to therapy, I feel like this is something my therapist has to say to me a lot. Hey, instead of blame shifting, instead of like just reacting and getting angry, instead of like diving into the shame spiral, why don't you just sit and get curious about it for a minute? Most scholars, biblical scholars, tend to think that this question, why did God allow Israel to be defeated? Most scholars think that this question is the key to unlocking the entire Old Testament. From Genesis to Malachi, everything is written to answer why Israel was defeated while God still claimed to be king. The Old Testament is Israel's answering that question by processing their past. The way we survive tragedy and trauma is by learning to tell the truth about ourselves, about our nation, about our churches, Not just the truths we think everybody wants to hear, not just the truths that get partisan clapping. The full textured truth of how sometimes we're the good guys and sometimes we're the bad guys, and most of the time we are a mixed bag because we too are sinners. The problem is, as any psychologist and therapist will also tell you, whether on an individual or collective level, our sense of self is often bound up in the lies we tell ourselves. We wouldn't collectively know who we are as a people, as a nation, as a church, as individuals if we were forced to come to terms with the fact that we're not always the good guy in the story. We wouldn't know who we are if we had to tell the truth. That's why in Isaiah 59, Isaiah leads them all the way through their sins. And then the very last line is this: truth stumbles in the streets and honesty has been outlawed. Yes, truth is gone. And anyone who renounces evil is attacked. He's saying that individuals and communities that are willing to do the honest, self-reflective work where we come to terms with ourselves as imperfect human beings and therefore participants in a society of imperfect human beings. When you are willing to do that hard work and then tell the full textured truth to a society of lies, that's never going to go well for you. Like, I don't know what we expected. It seems to me that often, okay, so let me explain why I preach the way I do. When I was in college, went to a Christian college. I went to a Southern Baptist college, and I had to go to chapel twice a week. And every single time they would bring in these big-time local Northeast Missouri pastors to come and rile these college students up for Jesus, right? And every single time I just knew it was going to be crap. I remember thinking to myself, you're going to get a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to say something to people at a crucial moment in their life, and you're going to come with this? Like, this is the best you've got? And so I decided then I was never going to be that person. That if I was going to be that person, I would go do something else. And so I decided then and there, look, you can agree with my sermons, you can disagree with my sermons, you can think whatever you want about my sermons, but you will never say of Tom didn't put in the work. And it's because I have seen preacher after preacher and pastor after pastor not work. But what happens when we don't put in the work is that we don't learn, we don't have to tell the truth. And no one is confronted with the truth. But should not the church be the place of the truth, even when it's complicated? We don't want to tell the truth about our past, and so we blame others, or we deflect from it, or we tell little nicer truths about ourselves. Also, we don't have to take responsibility for our actions. And we end up even recruiting God to help us do it. This is what Isaiah is actually accusing Israel of doing. They keep saying, are God's arms too short to save us? Are God's ears plugged to hear us? And Isaiah says, it's actually you. It's your sins that have cut you off from God. Because of your sins, he has turned away and will not listen to anyone. Now, speaking of trying to do the work, this is the NLT's translation. I think they actually miss what's happening, because what they're saying is that God has turned away, that the people's sin is so much, and so that God turns their back. The Hebrew is actually, I think, much more interesting, The Hebrew is not placing the blame on God, is actually placing the blame on the people. And what they're saying is not God is turning away. What they're saying is something that would be equivalent to our idiom of, you keep trying to put a bag over God's eyes so that God can't see. But God still sees all of your injustices. You can't actually blind God. This is why the text then goes and talks about like, we, not God, we are the ones like blind folks groping along the wall trying to figure out where we're going. It's not that God doesn't see. You can't blind God by putting a bag over God's eyes. It's not how it works. The problem is that their sins have limited what they're capable of seeing. And this I think is just key. I mentioned this a week or two ago. The reason why we have such a hard time coming up with solutions to our problems on individual and national levels is often because we aren't willing to tell the full truth about those problems, and therefore we only see limits. We only see a limited number of options, or the options our political party tells us that we're allowed to see. You're going to tell me that there aren't better options for handling immigration in America than picking up people on the side of the street? You're going to tell me there's not a better option than that? Look, you don't have to be pro-immigration to say shipping people to Uganda and El Salvador is not a good, viable, just solution. But when our political parties say, no, this is the answer, it limits what we're capable of seeing. Isaiah is saying, hey, here you are wondering why God isn't showing up to rescue you, but you spend all your days trying to blind God like Odysseus blind the Cyclops. But God can still see the way you treat your most vulnerable neighbors. Societal decline is not God's fault. We have to process the past. And I use very key language there. I use the language of we and our, because I don't know if you noticed this when Vicky was reading. But Isaiah moved from, in the passage, he moved from using the third person plural, they. They sinned. And then in the middle of the passage, he shifts it to the second person plural. And he starts saying, you sinned, you all sinned. But I don't know if you noticed, by the end of the passage, he shifts it to the first person plural. We are the problem. We can spend all day and all night blaming other people, and it's convenient, it's easier. It's what our left and right media tell us to do. It is what MSNBC wants us to do, to blame the Republicans. It's what Fox News wants us to do, is blame the liberals. And listen, there's a lot of blame to go around. You can make, as their business model shows, you can make billions of dollars getting people just to blame each other. And the fact is, there is blame. I'm not trying to minimize that there's blame, but what I'm trying to say is that you can make money by just making it about them so that people never have to do the self-reflective work of owning how they are also part of the problem. In Jewish and Christian traditions, Isaiah performs what we call self-examination. It is a processing of our past and our behaviors, both our individual past and our collective past. And self-examination in the tradition usually has three basic components. Number one, seeing. Number two, naming. And number three, confessing. And at every step, our society attempts to avoid every single one of these. Liberal and conservative, doesn't matter. Our society protects us from even seeing the trauma caused by American involvement in the world. We don't tell the stories of how we're complicit in genocide. We erase the stories from museums that might remind us of 350 years of people who look like me enslaving people who have a different skin color. We don't want to see it because seeing it makes us uncomfortable. And when we are accused, when we do see it, when we do lament our failures, when we do say these things out loud, we are then accused of hating America. Even though, in my estimation, to really love something, you tell the truth about it. Because otherwise, all you love is the illusion of it. This is why some of you folks, I get to say this, I've been married for 20 years now. Some of you folks, you get married really early, and you're just like, early in your marriage, you're like, I just love this person, I'd do anything. Yeah, because you don't know them yet. I'm the old guy now, I get to say this, right? Wait till you get to know them. Then you really get to love them, right? Because you see the full textured part of a person over time. You know all of their mistakes. You know all of their failures. You know all of their insecurities. You know all the beauties of who they are. You know all the greatness. You know all of their intentions and all the ways that they fail to live up to their intentions. And love means you can see all of that and love them anyway. You can tell the truth about all of that and still love them anyway. It's not love when you refuse to acknowledge that people fail to live up to who they want to be. That's not love. And once we're forced to actually see, say, a situation where we can't avoid seeing what we've done, our society still tries to provide us alternative language so that we can't fully name what we've done. Do you know this terminology? It's called euphemism, right? The prefix "eu" means good, to take something and put a positive spin on it by using a lighter, better word, right? There was the interview with Louis Giglio and Lecrae, who's Louis Giglio is a white guy, Lecrae is an African American Christian rapper, and they were talking, and Louis Giglio was like, I feel like we don't fully acknowledge how beneficial slavery was. And he says, it was a blessing. Black folks learned work skills. And Lecrae just sat there and said nothing. Because you can't call out racism in white evangelical spaces, even when it's hitting you in the face. Instead, racism gets reimagined as a blessing for black folks. That's the world folks want to live in, where we can't tell the truth without making it sound like it's good, even for the oppressed person. I'm going to use an example from the other side now, so I can just be an equal opportunity, get it, everybody. The liberal media and the Democrats keep trotting out Bill Clinton every time they need a vote or they need to raise some money. Listen, man, if you're going to sit here and say that our current guy was on Epstein Island, you better be willing to say this dude was on Epstein's Island. And even if neither of them were, we know what he did while in office. And the liberal media, you know what they will never call it? They will never call it rape. Here's why. Here's why I use that strong terminology. Pastors, it is illegal for us to have intercourse with our congregants. Do you know why? Because the power differential in our relationship means that it can never be consensual. Am I right, Martha? Martha's a pastor. Was a pastor. She's retired. She retired 63 years ago when she married Jerry. The power differential is recognized legally as so vast that it cannot be considered consensual. How much more so when you're dealing with a mere intern and the most powerful man in the United States? But the liberal media and the Democrats not only won't call it what it is, but they keep trotting this man out every time they need votes and money. And then we turn around and we're mad when the other side elects a guy who has 36 credible accusations against him and has been convicted of a sexual assault. You don't get to be mad only when it's one side. How about we be mad at both sides? How about we acknowledge that our partisanship is part of the problem that makes us unable to name it when we see it? Our society protects us from naming the truth, and the long-term impact is that we just have predator after predator after predator, and nobody has the moral authority to say anything about it. And when you cannot name the truth, you also cannot confess the truth. Christian confession requires a refusal to use excuses, a refusal to blame other people, a refusal to minimize, a refusal to deflect. It requires that I own my part of the history. It requires that we process the past. This is why our communion liturgy intentionally every week begins with confession. We are, in at least the most general terms possible, trying to begin the process of telling the truth to ourselves so that we don't convince ourselves that we're throwing a bag over God's eyes. We are trying to learn to be honest with ourselves, because only in honesty can we begin to heal the wounds that we have inflicted on our neighbors, especially our most vulnerable neighbors. And that healing is the church's job. This is why we exist. Holy love for God, holy love for neighbor, and holy love for self that tells the full textured truth about the world, including not only its sinfulness, but also the deep, deep love of God for it in its sinfulness. I fear that particularly in the Bible Belt, one of the reasons why we don't tell the truth to ourselves is because people who do what I do have for so long just talked about sin and haven't sufficiently talked about the God whose love is so much deeper than my sin. I don't have to feel deep, deep, crippling shame over what I've done. What I have to do is trust. Faith means trust. Trust that God's love is deeper than all I have ever done, and therefore I can tell the truth about what I've done, and I can begin to repair the damage that I've done, because I know my identity is not in the lie, but in the truth that I'm loved. The church is not supposed to be a propaganda piece for America. The church is not supposed to be the most patriotic or partisan community in the world, but we are supposed to be the most honest community in the world. And that begins with self-honesty. That begins with processing the past and telling the truth, the full textured truth. So that was a nice little devotionette.